Welcome, everyone. I finally have another story for you. Thank you so much for being so patient with me. I know this one took quite a while, but it's finally here. This one has a prison setting, one of my guilty pleasures. But then again, I don't think there's anything to be guilty about, I think. So I've been meaning to write this story for quite a while. I wasn't sure on how to go about it, and I was worried that it wouldn't be as what I wanted it to be. Well, eventually I got to it and I had a great time working on it. And I can actually see myself writing more stories with a prison setting in the near future. So without further ado, let's start. And I hope you guys have a great time reading or listening to it as well.
Chapter 1. I was holding a mug. That was the first thing I noticed. The ceramic heat against my palm, the smell of coffee. The break room came into focus slowly. I looked at the calendar, pinned to the wall. I stared at it for a long time. I almost convinced myself I was dreaming. I had come back. My mind reached for the last thing I remembered. A rainy night. One too many drinks sloshing around in my gut as I stepped off the curb toward the train station. The headlights of the truck before impact. Then something else surfaced. It hit me like cold water straight to the face. A date. A time. Something Cho had told me once, stammering through his tears in a police detention room. My eyes dropped to my watch. I dropped my mug. The crack of ceramic on tile was jarring, but I was already through the door, breaking into a run down the corridor. Someone called my name. I didn't stop. Outside, I threw my arm out at the nearest taxi and yanked the door open before it had fully stopped. Opulent hotel. I gave the cross streets. Fast as you can. I'll pay extra. I sat in the back seat and tried to make my breathing even. I was already late. Cho. 21 years old and probably terrified out of his mind. Right now, alone in a hotel room with something he hadn't planned for and couldn't undo. I pressed my knuckle to my mouth and thought about the last time I'd seen my brother's face, flushed with embarrassment when I fussed over him, rolling his eyes when I reminded him to eat properly, and the other face. Gray and still, gone forever. The taxi finally pulled up to the luxury hotel. Inside, two receptionists stood behind a long curved desk, both of them occupied with a group of guests mid-check-in, luggage piled around them. I walked in and didn't pause. There was a bellhop near the entrance talking to another cluster of guests, a luggage trolley sitting unattended in the corner. I walked to the trolley and wheeled it to the elevator like I belonged here, like I did this every day. 5th floor. The elevator opened onto a quiet corridor, light wallpaper, and soft lighting. I left the trolley by the elevator and sprinted toward room 502. I knocked hard on the door. Cho. Nothing. I knocked again. Cho, it's me. Open up now. My hand paused mid-air as the sound of the deadbolt being fumbled with came through and the door swung open. My brother looked at me like I was a ghost. He was pale, his eyes were wide, and for a moment he looked nothing like 21. He looked 6. He looked the way he had the night our parents didn't come home from dinner, the night we found out they weren't coming home at all, taken by a car accident somewhere between the restaurant and us. There was blood on Cho's shirt. I bit my lip. I'd been hoping, some stupid, irrational part of me had been hoping that I'd been wrong about the timing, that there was still time, that I'd get here and find nothing had happened yet. But the blood was already there, and Cho's hands were shaking at his sides, and I knew. It was done. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. Cho's breathing was too fast, too shallow, the edge of hyperventilation beginning to pull at him. I reached up and covered his mouth. Breathe, I said, steadily. The way I'd learned to speak to him a long time ago, when he was small and frightened and I was 18 and had no idea what I was doing but had to pretend otherwise. Through your nose. Slow. His eyes were wild above my hand, but he tried. I watched his chest heave a few times, then begin to slow. Good, I didn't move my hand yet. Keep going. When I was satisfied the hyperventilating had stopped, I lowered my hand. He looked back at me, eyes wet. I already knew the answer. I asked anyway, "Is he dead?" Cho's tears spilled over as he nodded. I pulled my brother into a hug, he shuddered against me and then fell apart. When the worst of the trembling had passed, I pulled back and took his face in my hands. Listen to me. You are not going to say a word about this, not to the police, not to anyone. You're going to keep your mouth shut and you're going to do exactly what I tell you. You understand? I wanted to hold him longer. I wanted to let him cry properly and tell him that I was here and it was going to be okay. But I didn't have time for any of it. I was not going to lose him again. Where is he? Cho swallowed. Bathroom. The body lay on the floor, a screwdriver stuck in one of its eyes, the same screwdriver Cho had mentioned in his statement in the previous life, found in the bathroom cabinet of all places, left behind by some careless maintenance worker. Mr. Zhu had been a man who had used other people's fear as leverage, who had found a frightened 21-year-old on a gay dating app and had threatened to out Cho, to expose him, and had used that threat to drag him to that hotel room. I walked back out to Cho, who was standing exactly where I'd left him. About 20 minutes later, the corridor outside erupted. Cho's screaming was convincing. It didn't take much, I supposed, given that it was real fear coming out of him, just redirected. A few minutes later, the hotel staff came inside. I was sitting on the edge of the bed when they came through the door. The blood on my shirt and on my right hand was Mr. Zhu's, transferred deliberately. The screwdriver was in my grip. I set it on the floor when the first officer entered. My heart rate had come down by then. In my previous life, I had stood in a police station feeling utterly powerless, filling out forms, listening to my brother try to explain himself in a hushed voice, his eyes haunted. I thought about the phone call I'd received in that other life, the one from the police informing me that my brother had been detained in connection with the death of a Mr. Zhu at the opulent hotel. I thought about the detention room where Cho had sat with his shoulders caved in. I thought about the courtroom, the sentence. 8 years. And Cho's face as they read it? Broken. And then the other call. 7 months later. From the prison. I had driven in a state of complete numbness that lasted for the rest of my life. I had gone to work, I had come home, I had eaten when I remembered to and stopped eating when I forgot. I had drunk far too much on far too many evenings, which was how I had ended up stepping off a curb in the rain into the path of a truck. I looked up at the officer standing in the doorway of room 502 and felt something that was almost peaceful. Cho was going to carry on living without a prison sentence hanging over him. Whatever came next for me, I'd already decided I could live with it. Chapter 2. 2 months in detention center, then the courtroom. I was represented by a portly man named Attorney Liu. I remember the prosecution laying out their version of events. I had been found in the room, I had been holding the weapon, the blood had been on my hands. Attorney Liu argued self-defense. He painted a picture of a younger brother in danger, an older brother who had arrived to find a situation already beyond control, who had acted in the only way available to him. He introduced evidence of Mr. Zhu's history, nothing that had ever been formally reported, but enough, gathered from enough sources, to suggest that the man had made a habit of blackmailing vulnerable people. 2 of them had agreed to testify, their voices trembling as they did so. The prosecution objected to their relevance twice. Attorney Liu overrode both objections with determination. Whether my position at the bank helped, I couldn't say. Maybe it gave me a face that was easier for the court to consider sympathetically. Maybe it meant nothing at all, and the outcome rested entirely on the facts as Attorney Liu had arranged them. The judge read the verdict. 7 years. I heard Cho make a sound from somewhere behind me, like something had hit him in the chest. They gave me a few minutes with Cho before the transfer. He looked terrible. He'd looked terrible throughout the trial, the shadows under his eyes deepening by the week. Now he stood in front of me and cried in earnest. "I'm sorry, guh-guh, I'm so sorry, I'm sorry, I should have, if I had just..." "Cho." I put both hands on his shoulders and waited until he looked at me. His eyes were red, his face blotchy. "Stop." He stopped. "Barely. You're going to live well. That's not a request. You're going to study. You're going to work hard. You're going to eat properly and sleep enough and not do anything that would make me have to worry about you from inside a cell. Because I will find out and I will be furious." I smiled despite the ache in my chest. "You're going to visit me every 2 or 3 months. And when you come, you bring spicy pork and many other delicious foods you can find." Cho nodded, tears still streaming down his face. I kissed his cheek. He didn't pull away like I expected him to. And the only way that any of this means anything, the only way you can actually make this right, is to live so well that my investment pays off. You understand me? I need a return on this. I'm a banker. He laughed and then immediately started crying harder. He grabbed me and hugged me, his arms tight around my back, his face pressed into my shoulder the way he used to when he was small and had a nightmare. "Take care of yourself, Joe. I mean it." The prison was a big building, plain and efficient looking. I was processed quite easily, followed by a brief orientation. Then came the uniform. Pale blue, the same uniform Cho wore in the previous life. I followed the officer down a corridor that smelled of lavender floor cleaner. The sounds of the facility could be heard. Distant voices, the particular ambient hum of a large building full of people in close quarters. I kept my face neutral. My cell was on the 3rd floor. "New arrival," he said to whoever was inside, and walked away. The room was expectedly small. 2 narrow beds, 2 sets of shelves, a window high on the wall that let in a rectangle of afternoon light, clean enough. On the far bed sat a young man. He was lean, fine-featured. He stared at me. He looked surprised, shocked. His lips parted slightly. He shook his head, and then he simply nodded at me. His name, I would learn later that evening at dinner when a warden read from a list, was Zhu. Chapter 3. The following weeks were not what I had expected. This was largely a product of having watched prison dramas. I had braced myself for something out of those films. Immediate confrontation, some kind of brutal initiation, a hierarchy through violence. I had gone to sleep on my first night with my back to the wall, waiting. Nothing happened. Breakfast was served at 6:30. It was plain congee with a side of pickled vegetables and a hard-boiled egg. Edible. The days had a routine, meals, a period of assigned work, exercise time in the compound, remaining hours that were yours to fill with reading or conversation or staring at the ceiling if that was what you needed. The wardens were neither cruel nor warm. Shu was easy to get along with. His baby face made him look closer to 19 than 25. He didn't ask nosy questions. He didn't try to establish dominance or test me in any of the ways I'd half expected. During meals, he made conversation about neutral things, like the food, a book he was reading, the best areas for sunbathing. In our cell, he minded his own business. He was a perfectly reasonable cellmate. Except for the staring. Not always, but enough to notice. A glance that lasted a beat too long in the dining hall, eyes that I caught on me in the exercise yard before they slid away, the sense, when I was reading or occupied with something, of being watched, and then looking up to find Shu already looking at something else. Then, one night, about 3.5 weeks in, we were both getting ready for bed. Shu was on his side of the room. I was smoothing out my blanket when he spoke. "Do you have a brother?" I said I did. He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something. The lights went out. "Good night, guh-guh." Over those weeks, I gathered what I could about him through the ordinary drift of conversation. He had 11 years total, 7 still ahead of him. He didn't offer the reason, and I didn't ask. And he had strong opinions whenever a particular inmate named Tung was mentioned. One day, I was at lunch and nearly done when I became aware of a group of men staring at us from the table across from ours. A pointed, deliberate attention, with grins. I looked at Shu to ask who they were. He was already looking at them. His chopsticks were in a white-knuckled grip. His jaw was set in a way I hadn't seen before, a contained fury. I touched his arm. "Library, come on." The prison library was modest. 3 walls of shelves, a handful of tables, the smell of old paper. At that hour, it was nearly empty. We took a table in the corner. "Who are they?" Shu's jaw was still tight. "He's the one who—" He stopped himself. Something shifted in his expression, and when he spoke again, his voice had come back to something more level. Tung and his men. Tung's the bald one, with the scar. The man had been impossible to miss now that I had a name for him. Large, broad-shouldered, the scar running in a pale line from above his left ear to somewhere past his jaw. It was clear Shu's feelings on Tung went beyond general dislike. He looked at me with an expression that was close to pleading. "Stay away from him. Guh-guh, don't be alone in a room with him. Don't give him any reason to notice you. He put an inmate in the hospital. Before you came, the man was in there for a month." There was something underneath the warning, something personal that Shu wasn't saying. I didn't push it. Not yet. Following Shu's warning turned out to be straightforward enough in practice. The facility was large enough that keeping my distance from a few people was doable. I kept track of where Tung and his group tended to be, and I tended to be elsewhere. Life continued in its unglamorous way. Then one evening in the mess hall, a man at the next table started choking. I looked over to see a heavyset man on his feet, hands at his throat, face already a deep red. I was out of my seat in a beat. I got behind the man. He was a full head taller than me. I locked my hands together just below his ribcage. I pulled. Nothing. I adjusted my grip, drove my fist up and in, pulled again with everything I had. The man staggered. We nearly went down together. I planted my feet and tried again. Third attempt. Something gave. A chunk of pork belly flew from his mouth and hit the floor. The man gasped and grabbed the nearest table to stop himself from dropping. I had mastered the Heimlich maneuver ever since Cho's choking incident when he was 9. The mess hall, which had gone almost completely silent, cheered. The man turned around. He was still catching his breath. He was probably mid-40s with a broad, flat face. He thanked me in a raspy voice. A warden stepped forward, said, "Good job," and then guided him toward the infirmary. I watched him go, then looked down at my hands, which were shaking. Through Shu, I learned the man I saved was Wang. He had been in for 7 years and had 7 more to go. He had taken the fall for his brother, a murder charge. The brother ran a significant operation outside these walls and was not a man people said no to. Yep, a gangster. Wang, inside the prison, had his own kind of operation. He had people, he had reach, he had apparently an ability to make things happen within the facility. "And Tung?" I asked. Shu scowled. Different group. Tung's in for 3 murders. He and Wang's group don't love each other, but they keep the peace, mostly. Now that I thought about it, the tension at mealtimes made more sense. The careful distances maintained between the men, the way certain tables functioned as invisible borders. Chapter 4. Despite my thoroughness, I was still cornered on a nice afternoon. I knew the area was less monitored. I had noted it in my first week, the same way I used to note the blind spots in our bank's floor layout. Knowing about a risk and successfully avoiding it indefinitely are 2 different things, and on that particular afternoon, my timing was simply bad. There were 4 of them. Tung in front, his men spread loosely behind. The corridor was narrow, and the nearest camera was around a corner. Tung looked at me with an expression that inspired violence. At him. "I've been watching you, bank manager. Very impressive." I said nothing. "I could use someone pretty like you," he smiled, as a bed partner. Rage moved hot through my chest. I sneered, "No?" Tung's smile stayed. "I don't think you understood." I understood perfectly. The answer is no. The smile flickered. Behind him, one of his men shifted. "You've got a mouth on you," Tung said. "I've been told." Tung lunged at me. I reacted with a punch. I got one good swing in, connected with something, felt the impact travel up my arm, and then the men got me. 2 of them had my arms before I'd fully processed being grabbed. A third drove a fist into my stomach hard enough to fold me, and then there were hands on my collar and Tung was moving toward me, with that smile back in place despite his bleeding lip. He cupped my chin and gave me a look that made goosebumps break out across my skin. Then the corridor filled with people. They came around the corner in a group, 7, 8, 9 of them. At the front was Wang. He looked at the scene in front of him with an almost bored displeasure. The 2 groups looked at each other. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Tung straightened up, adjusted his collar, and left. His men followed. Wang watched them go. Then he crossed the distance between us and dusted off my shoulder with 2 brisk pats. "You're under my protection now." I thanked him. Shu's reaction, when I relayed the events later, involved the most colorful language I'd ever heard. After he was done, he said, "At least Wang's involved now. You saved exactly the right man." Rubbing my sore belly, I suppose that was true. He then looked at me with a grimace. "I probably should have had you join Wang's group sooner." 2 days later, the sun was out in all its glory. The compound caught it well in the morning, and a loose collection of inmates had arranged themselves along the south-facing wall to absorb it. I had found a comfy spot when Wang appeared. He dropped down beside me. He nodded at Shu, who was a few meters away. "You, Sil's bed partner?" I managed to keep my expression even. "No." Wang nodded. "Then you need one." "I really don't." "You do," Wang spoke with finality. "I can help with that." Seeing my expression, he chuckled. "Shu didn't tell you how things work here, did he?" He settled back against the wall. "It's a system. Practical. You're not a fighter by trade, which means you're better protected with someone who is. Bed partner arrangement means they keep you safe. That's the whole thing. Don't worry, it's strictly protection. Unless you don't want it to be." I shook my head and Wang continued. "Shu's good, but he's not enough for Tung. You need someone who makes Tung think twice before he even considers crossing the yard. I have exactly that person in mind. Meet me in the library after lunch." After lunch, I headed to the library. Wang was already there when I arrived, seated at one of the tables with a man I hadn't seen before. The man was tall, taller than Wang, taller than most people, with a straight-backed posture. Sharp features, a set jaw, dark eyes, quite good-looking. Wang stood and gestured between us with the pride of a man presenting a successful project. "This is Zhang. He's been in solitary." Zhang nodded at me. "Why solitary?" Wang's grin widened. knocked out 3 teeth of a man who insulted his mother. Zhang said nothing. Wang then told me that I would be moving to share a cell with Zhang. Zhang's cellmate would move to Shu's cell. I stared at him. You can do that? I can do that, Wang confirmed. As I packed up my belongings, Shu nodded to himself. Zhang's a fortress. You'll be extra safe now. Over the following days, I found Zhang to be a quiet guy. He had 5 more years to go. He was organized, kept his side of the cell orderly, did not snore like Shu did, and had no irritating habits that I could identify. He also, true to Wang's word, made no move toward me. The protection part he took seriously. Tung's group still looked at me when our paths crossed, but the looks had changed. They were more cautious. Zhang had formed a habit of simply standing near me, face impenetrable. I was grateful for it. I was also aware that it looked, from the outside, like I had become his bed partner. Well, a small price to pay. And at least the normalized casualness of the bed partner system in here made the whole arrangement considerably less awkward. I had once turned a corner near the laundry and found 2 men pressed against the wall in a most passionate kiss. About 2 weeks in, we were in the communal bathroom during the morning wash. 9 men, 9 shower heads, finite hot water. I was rinsing shampoo out of my hair when my foot hit a patch of wet tile that was somehow wetter and more treacherous than the rest. I went down fast, but I did not hit the floor. Zhang caught me with an arm across my chest, hand gripping my side. He was solid as a wall. I grabbed his arm and righted myself, opened my mouth to say thank you, and became aware of something pressing against my lower back. A substantial something. I straightened up, murmured a thank you, and continued washing with renewed speed. Behind me, Zhang remained quiet. A few days later, we were assigned kitchen duty together, a small group of us set to peeling vegetables for the afternoon meal. The radishes came in a large basin and we worked through them steadily, the only sounds the scrape of peelers and the occasional exchange between the men further down the counter. I was halfway through my pile when I heard a small, sharp intake of breath beside me. I glanced over. Zhang had nicked his finger. A small cut, the peeler catching the side of his ring finger, a bright bead of blood welling up immediately. I took his hand and put his finger in my mouth without thinking. It was the most natural thing in the world. I had done it for Cho countless times. The reflex was so thoroughly installed in me that only after a moment my brain caught up with the fact that the finger in my mouth did not belong to my brother but to a 30-year-old man who was looking at me dumbfounded and red-faced. I removed the finger and turned back to my radishes. Zhang was excused by the supervising warden. The others noticed nothing. Small mercies. A few days later, I was in the library with a novel and interesting folklore when I became aware of being watched. I kept reading, finished the page, and looked up. Zhang was at the table across from me, his own book open in front of him. He had on an intense expression. The moment our eyes met, he looked down at his book. First Zhu, then Zhang. They sure did a lot of staring. I had heard from Wang the reason Zhang was in here. A man had violated his younger sister. Zhang had found out and had taken a baseball bat to him and hadn't stopped until he was dead. Killing was never the answer. But if I had been in Zhang's place, I wasn't entirely sure I would have done differently. Chapter 5. Cho came on a weekend a little over a month into my sentence. The visiting room was a long rectangle, with tables bolted to the floor and chairs on either side. Families sat across from inmates. Cho came through the door holding a rather large bag. He was wearing a collared shirt in a dark blue, and his hair was combed neatly. His face scrunched up with emotion when he saw me. I stood up. He crossed the room, and we held on to each other for a long moment. When we sat down, his eyes went immediately to my face, cataloging, checking. He exhaled, then he reached into the bag he'd brought and began producing food from it. There were containers of braised pork belly, steamed egg, with a pour of soy sauce darkening the top, a big portion of noodles with chili oil gleaming across the surface, a handful of chopped spring onions, cold cucumber salad with garlic and vinegar, and finally, 2 milk chocolate bars. I smiled. You remembered. Cho shrugged. I closed my eyes and took a deep whiff of the food. The prison kitchen was not bad, exactly. It was cooked for volume and nutrition, but it could never beat food from outside. I ate with pleasure. Cho watched me with a small smile. I would have been in considerably worse shape without Wang's generosity. Once a week, Wang arranged for takeout to reach his favored group through his secret channels. Proper restaurant food rotating through whatever the man felt like that week, accompanied occasionally by sweets, red bean pastries, sesame balls, milk pudding, etc. And then there was Zhang, who had discovered, through conversation, that I had a weakness for anything sweet. Since that discovery, Zhang had been quietly rerouting his dessert portions in my direction. This had started with a single red bean bun, slid across to my side one evening. I had slid it back, he had slid it back. We had continued this back and forth for a couple of times before Wang, who had been watching this from his spot on the floor with his back against the wall, leaned over and ate it. That made Shu laugh so hard he choked on his food. The second time, Zhang placed the item directly in my hand and turned to face the wall. The third time, I accepted it easily, and Zhang smiled. By the fourth time, the guilt had evaporated. Once the food was wiped clean and Cho packed up the containers, we talked for most of the hour. He was taking an extra course in finance. He'd picked up a part-time job at a cafe near our apartment. He was sleeping properly, or something close to it. I told him I was having a rather fine time here in prison. Cho didn't look like he believed me, but I smiled wide all the same. It was at some point in the second half of the hour that I thought about Shu's expression when I'd mentioned offhandedly at breakfast that my brother was coming. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I'd been too focused on the visit. Shu's face had changed. Something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like longing. Very intense longing. I turned it over. Shu had never met Cho. Cho had never met Shu. They ran in entirely different circles, different ages, different worlds. And yet... Cho, do you know anyone named Shu? Cho shook his head. No. Why? I shrugged. When the hour ended, Cho looked at me across the table with everything he wasn't saying arranged plainly on his face, the helplessness and guilt he was still carrying. He picked up his bag, then paused. I've been meaning to ask, how did you know I was in trouble? That day? I smiled. Sixth sense. Cho searched my face. I kept the smile steady and said nothing more. He let it go. More spicy pork next time, he said instead. I'll come back in 2 months, maybe less. 2 months is fine. You have things to do. Go live your life. That's the deal. He nodded and walked out without looking back. I sat for a moment after he'd gone. Shu was in the corridor when I returned. He was leaning against the wall near the cell with his arms crossed, doing a convincing impression of someone who just happened to be there. I said, my brother just left. Shu deflated. He nodded, said nothing, looked at the floor. This young man, 25 years old, serving an 11-year sentence, with a baby face that belonged somewhere else and eyes that held something he wasn't ready to say. Who had gone very still when I'd mentioned Cho's visit, who was now standing in this corridor, looking like a kicked puppy over the departure of someone he had never met. There was something the man was hiding, I was sure. I held out one of the chocolate bars from my brother. Shu took it with both hands. His eyes grew shiny. I was about to ask if he was all right when Zhang came around the corner. Shu gave Zhang a quick greeting. Then he tucked the chocolate bar against his chest and hurried down the corridor. I broke off a piece of the remaining chocolate bar and slipped it into Zhang's mouth. Chapter 6. The morning Shu didn't show up to breakfast. I noticed immediately. Post-breakfast, I asked Zhu's roommate if he'd seen him. The man shrugged. I was headed to the library with Zhang when I saw them bringing Shu out. He was unconscious. The stretcher came through the corridor with 2 wardens on either side. Shu's left eye was swollen to a slit. His nose had bled, and the blood had dried in a dark trail down his chin. His right arm was at a weird angle. I asked the nearest warden what happened. The warden shook his head. Officer Lau, one of the men whose cooperation Wang had secured through generous bribes. We need to take him to the infirmary first, then hospital. Step back. The stretcher moved away. I stood in the corridor and watched it go around the corner and disappear. Behind me, Zhang patted my shoulder. I found Wang in the library. I sat down across from him. Wang closed the book in his lap. I'd bet half my lower cheeks it was tongue. Zhou's suffered fractures from what I heard. Leg too, and a broken rib. But he'll come back. Zhou's tough. I sighed. Do you know why Shu hates him specifically? Wang frowned. Not sure. It's like he woke up one day and started hating Tongue, and of course, Tongue reciprocated. I nodded, put the pieces I had, and looked at the shape they made. There was a theory forming in the back of my head for some time now. I put it aside. I would wait for Zhu to come back. I would ask him myself. In the following days, I kept to my routine. Breakfast, work assignment, exercise, lunch, library, dinner, evening, sleep, repeat. Zhang shadowed me through all of it, with a watchfulness that had increased several notches since Shu had been carried out on that stretcher. He was always slightly closer than necessary. 15 days later, Shu was back. I went directly to his room. He was sitting on the edge of his bed when I pushed the door open. There was a crutch leaning near the bed. He had a cast on his right arm and left leg, and his face had healed past the worst of it. He gave me a greeting. I sat on the opposite bed. Have you considered asking Wang for a bed partner? For protection. I'm fine, he said flatly. I let it go. Then I got straight to the point. You're keeping something from me. I didn't frame it as a question. The immediate seizing up of his body told me I was right. He opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. You knew something when I walked into our cell on the first day. When I mentioned Cho's visit, you looked like you wanted to meet him. You act like you know my brother, which is impossible. I kept my voice even. And Tongue, you hate the guy, and somehow he's probably part of whatever you're hiding. Shu seemed scared now. Just tell me. I waited a beat, then stood up and crossed to him, and he looked up at me with an expression so conflicted it was almost painful to see. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Tell me, I said again. After a few seconds of staring at each other, Shu's resistance fell apart and he sagged. Don't think I'm crazy, his voice came out soft. I won't. And finally, Shu began to talk. His words came out in an uneven rhythm, fast in some places, halting in others. He was reborn. He had come back to the past. He didn't know how, but he was glad for it. And that, in the previous life, it had not been me in this cell. It had been Cho. I swallowed hard and kept my face still. Cho had come to this facility with his 8-year sentence and his caved-in shoulders and his eyes that had already gone somewhere unreachable, and Shu had been his cellmate. They had found each other inside a closed and difficult world. They had been together. And then Tongue had happened. I felt my hands close in my lap. Tung had set his sights on Cho in the 4th month. Cho was young, slight, visibly frightened, still raw from the sentencing and the shame of it. Tung had begun with small things, taking Cho's food, cornering him in low-monitored areas with his men flanking him, whispered things that Shu only heard secondhand, threats dressed up as suggestions. Cho had made him promise not to do anything reckless. Shu had promised. He had broken the promise within a week. He had caught Tung touching Cho. He had gone after Tung with everything he had, which, without Wang, without a group, without anyone at his back, had not been close to enough. Tung's men had taken him apart in a corridor without camera. He had woken up in the nearest hospital with 2 cracked ribs, broken wrist, and a split in his lip that needed 4 stitches. And while he was in the hospital, unable to get back, unable to reach Cho, Tung had gone to Cho's cell. Shu stopped here. He looked at his hands for a long moment. When he continued, his voice was several degrees colder. Cho never told me the details. He didn't have to. I sat very still. This information was so painful. My chest hurt. Shu's eyes were wet. It was my fault. If I had been patient, I could have been there for him when he needed me most. I returned too late. After that, Cho stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping. He'd sit on his bed and look at the wall. And when I talked to him, he'd answer, but he wasn't there anymore. Not fully. I tried. I stayed close. I thought if I just stayed close enough. He stopped. I should have stayed closer. Cho's tears finally fell and I couldn't stop my own. My brother. My little brother, who I had raised from 6 years old, who complained about being babied, who had looked fine when I had paid a visit in another life. My brother had been alone in a cell in this place with something done to him that he couldn't carry. Shu continued when I reopened my eyes. One night, about a month after he was gone, I woke up to find I had gone back in time. I was months back, before Cho came. He swallowed. I swore I'd protect him this time. I started working out, getting stronger. I even joined Wang's group to strengthen protection. I also pulled Wang aside early on and advised him to bring certain people under his side, the ones who, in the last life, had been on Tung's side. I was ready. He shook his head. And then you walked in instead of him. I thought about the day I'd arrived. Shu's face in the doorway of our cell, his confused face. I wiped my tears. He's out there. He's taken a finance course. He's living a normal life. Well, as normal as it can be. He's all right. Shu smiled through his tears. Then I reached over and took his hand and held it the way I would have held Cho's. It wasn't your fault, Shu. Shu looked down at our hands. You believe me, he said. I let out a slow breath. What were the odds? The two of us, sitting in a prison cell, both reborn. It was my turn now. Yes, I've come back too. He jerked back, eyes wide. I told him everything, room 502, the screwdriver, the body, the courtroom, the verdict, all of it. When I finished, Shu stared at me for a long moment. Incredible, so that's why Cho didn't come. You did. I nodded. Somewhere in the city, Cho was probably sitting in a lecture hall or behind a cafe counter. Alive, safe, out there. Chapter 7. The days after Shu's confession, I visited him every day while he was still on a crutch, and stuck close to him in the mess and in the library. We mostly talked about Cho. He talked about you constantly, Shu said. Every story started with my brother says, or my brother did this once. He looked at the table. What did he say? That you were the most capable person he knew and also completely insufferable about it. He said you made the best kanji he'd ever had, that you always put in extra salt and refused to acknowledge it was a mistake. It's not a mistake. Slightly salty kanji is better. Shu laughed. He said you'd say exactly that. I smiled. Then, because it seemed only fair, I gave Shu my own version of Cho. The funny incidents and the sad ones, the moments that had stayed with me longest. Shu listened to all of them with rapt attention. Then we sat in the quiet for a moment. Then, because it felt like the right time, I asked what I had decided not to ask in the first weeks. What are you in for? Shu pursed his lips. Manslaughter. I was just about to turn 21. My father was a drunk, had been for as long as I could remember. He beat my mother and me on the regular. My mother finally threw him out. He never accepted it. One night, I came home and found he'd forced his way back in. He had her by the throat. I struck him in the head with a hammer. He fell and never woke up. I didn't mean to kill him, but I'm not sure I'm sorry he's dead. He looked up at me with a wry smile. After the sentence, my mother cried for a month. She still visits every 3 months without fail. She sounds like a good woman, I said. She is. She deserved better than what she got. I patted his shoulder. Zhang, meanwhile, was becoming a problem. He had always been attentive. That was simply his nature, or at least his nature as expressed toward me, and I had adjusted to it over time. My newfound closeness to Shu must have been apparent because Zhang sat even closer to me, sitting with his arms crossed, contributing nothing to the conversation but refusing to be elsewhere. Zhu, to his credit, carried on talking without acknowledging it, though I could tell from the slight curve of his mouth that he was finding it entertaining. Then there was the afternoon I came back from visiting Shu to find Zhang standing in the corridor outside our cell. You were gone a long time. Nearly rolled my eyes. Zhang, Shu has a broken arm and a broken leg and a cracked rib. I know that. He didn't budge when I raised an eyebrow, so I patted his cheek, gave him a smile, and said, "Come to dinner." He came to dinner. He put half of his braised pork onto my plate and spent the meal being stony-faced at Shu, who sat across from us and ate his food, grinning from time to time. Later, while Zhang was in conversation with Wang across the yard, Shu materialized beside me. He likes you, guh-guh. I pursed my lips. Shu's face was full of glee. I'm not saying anything you don't already know. I didn't say you were. He raised an eyebrow, so you do know. I sighed. He's younger than me by 3 years. He's in here for 5 more years. I'm in here for 7. The circumstances are what they are, Shu cut me off. In here, this is as good as circumstances get. I clicked my tongue. Mind your own business. He grinned. I'm just saying. He knocked 3 teeth out of a man for his mother. That's very loyal. I could only roll my eyes. One day, we were in the afternoon sun. Shu was beside me with his eyes closed and his face tipped up. Zhang was a few meters away in conversation with Wang. It was mostly Wang talking while Zhang listened. I watched the light for a while. Then I declared, I'm gonna beat the crap out of Tung. Shu opened one eye, then both. I'm not gonna kill him, he's not worth the cost, but he deserves a good beating, at the very least. I'm in, Shu said. Zero hesitation. You've got a cast on your arm and leg? I'll hold him. You hit him. The cast makes it better, actually. Adds weight. Those men with Tung, I said, lowering my voice. His group. In the previous life, with Cho. They didn't take part. There was fire in Shu's eyes. Tung didn't share. But they knew, and they let it happen. I pushed my own anger down. We'll get to them, but Tung is first. Shu nodded. I had sat with this for weeks, since the night Shu had told me everything. I had let the rage move through me. I had molded it to power me through the decision I had come to. Shu leaned forward on his good arm. There's a place, behind the maintenance corridor. No cameras. It's where he had me beaten. A few minutes, maybe 3, between the warden rounds, 7 minutes if the afternoon shift is running late, which it usually is on Saturdays. As we nodded in agreement, I caught Zhang looking over at us. He held my gaze with an expression I had come to recognize and had chosen not to examine too closely. I looked away first. "He's going to be furious we didn't include him," Shu said. "I know." "They'll sulk. Is there a reason we're not including him?" I shrugged. 2 is easier to move than 3. Less noise, less coordination, less chance of something going wrong, and I don't want more people involved than necessary. Wang's group has kept a level of peace with tongues by not making moves. I don't want to drag more of them into whatever comes after. Shu sighed. "All right, make sure to console him once we're done." Soon enough, the day came, a lovely Saturday. We had our timing down, the maintenance corridor, 30 minutes into the afternoon work period when the supervision in that section was thinnest. Shu had confirmed, through previous observation, that Tung's routine brought him through the adjacent area on Saturdays. It was not a guaranteed intersection, but it was the best one we had, and when it didn't materialize on the first Saturday, we simply waited for the next. The second Saturday, it happened. Tung came through the corridor miraculously alone. That meant Tung's reckoning was just meant to be. He didn't see us until we were already moving. He looked at me, then at Shu. "Look at this! The banker and the cripple!" His smile was still ugly. "Shirt," I said to Shu. Shu moved faster than the casts, and Crutch suggested he could. The shirt went over Tung's head before he could react, covering his face entirely to disorient him, and Shu had him from behind in the same motion, one good arm locked across the man's chest using his body weight and the wall to pin him in place, the crutch discarded. I hit Tung. I had never been a violent man before my rebirth, but for Tung, I could make an exception. I hit him in the stomach first, then the ribs, then stopped thinking about it and went big on the beating. I gave in to the pure emotion of rage, pushing all thoughts away and focusing every ounce of energy into my fists and feet. At some point, Tung stopped making threats and started wheezing. I stopped when my own breath was coming hard and my knuckles were tender. I stepped back. Tung was against the wall now, no longer holding himself up. Shu stepped around him. He drew back and kicked Tung once, squarely in the stomach. By dinner, we knew that Tung had been taken to the nearest hospital with multiple fractures, arm, leg, broken ribs, etc. Across the dinner table, Wang shook his head at the two of us. "He had it coming," I said. "He absolutely had it coming," Wang agreed. "That's not the point. The point is he's going to come back angrier. Watch yourselves." I picked up a piece of chicken and plopped it onto Zhang's plate. "Eat," I nodded at his tray. Zhang looked away. The stony quality he'd been maintaining since we'd come back had not fully lifted, but he still picked up his chopsticks. "You should have told me," he sounded accusatory. I sighed and took his hand under the table, gave it a quick squeeze, then let go and went back to eating. I didn't look at him, but I knew he was smiling. He ate the chicken. The following afternoon, I was in the library. I had started a new book, a collection of poems. I was 3 poems in when I became aware of being watched. Here we go again, I thought. I kept reading for another paragraph, finished the page, looked up. Zhang was at the table across from me, his book closed. Sometimes he even had it open, pretending to read between stretches of simply staring at me. I thought about what Shu had said. In here, this is as good as circumstances get. Then I leaned across the table, close enough to keep it private. "You like me?" Zhang's ears went red. He was, in that moment, quite adorable, and I was aware that I was smiling. He nodded. I leaned back and picked up my book to resume reading. There were years ahead of me. I had a man who was devoted, arguably to an excessive degree, but I wasn't complaining. Might as well make the best of it. That night, after lights out, I lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the facility settling. A few minutes later, I got out of bed. The floor was cold under my feet. I crossed the distance between our beds and sat down on the edge of Zong's. He jolted upright, asking what was wrong. "Lie back," I ordered. He obeyed. I lay down beside him, tucking my head into the crook of his neck, feeling the warmth of him. He was very still. I pressed my lips to the side of his neck. "Do you want a reward?" I murmured. "For being patient?" His inhale was shaky. I felt it move through him. After a moment, barely above a whisper, "Yes." The following morning, I rotated my wrist experimentally. Yep, it was properly sore. I had not anticipated the previous night's demands to be that high. I looked at Zhang, who was standing by the shelf, straightening things that did not need straightening, a permanent grin on his face. Not once or twice, not even thrice. Four rounds that had my hand aching. Zhang's stamina indicated a future danger I was a bit worried about. Chapter 8. Weeks later, Tung came back. Unfortunately, Wang sipped his kanji with loud smacks. Yesterday evening, arm and leg still in casts, and with a crutch. He looks like he wants to burn the building down. I scoffed. "Shin." Wang set down his spoon. "I mean it about being careful. Tung is stupid and dangerous. He doesn't calculate. He just moves." The following days went by as usual. Tung moved through the common areas as he always had, the casts and crutch doing nothing to dent his swagger. He glared at me when our paths crossed. There was an even deeper venom in his eyes now, but he never said anything. In the meantime, Shu's casts came off. To celebrate, Wang brought in fried chicken, golden and crisp, the meat beneath juicy. We crowded into the cell, ate with gusto. At some point I laughed properly from the stomach and realized I hadn't done that in a while. One afternoon, I had finished my work assignment early and had an hour before dinner that I was planning to spend in the library. I turned into the corridor that ran behind the east wing toward the library entrance. Tung was there with two men. I had been careful for weeks. I had tracked Tung's movements, varied my own, kept to monitored areas, and yet, here I was, great. It had been all for nothing. Tung truly looked ready to murder. "Dear banker," he drawled, that cocky attitude overflowing. I smirked. "Should have stayed in the hospital longer, old man." He came at me. I moved, or tried to. In a panic, I threw out a punch. It didn't hit, and then the two men were on me from either side. I did not go down easily. I caught one of them hard across the jaw, and I had a handful of the other man's collar and was pulling him down when Tung came from my left side. I didn't see what was in his hand. I felt it. A shocking pressure on my left side below the ribs. Pain arrived a half second later, dropping me to my knees immediately. My hand went to my side. I heaved at the wet feeling I knew was blood. I gasped as the pain gnawed at me in full force. My vision wavered. The floor was cold. I was distantly aware of shouting from somewhere else, from farther away, coming closer. I tried to stand to no avail. It hurt too much. Shapes in the corridor, running, voices compounding on top of each other. I saw Zhang, and maybe Zhu. I couldn't hold on any longer. I slipped into darkness. I woke up in a hospital room. There was a tube in the back of my hand. There was a tightness around my midsection, and under the tightness, a deep, biting ache the moment I tried to shift position. I stilled to ease the pain. A police officer was sitting in the chair by the door. He looked up when I made a sound. He leaned out into the corridor and called for the nurse. She arrived with the doctor. The nurse checked my vitals. The doctor told me what I had missed. The surgery, the duration of my unconsciousness. A little over 20 hours. Minor damage to the large intestine. Repaired cleanly. 2 weeks minimum before I went back. I asked for water. The doctor shook his head. Not yet. 48 hours minimum after the surgery before we introduce fluids orally. He reached for something on the tray beside him and held it out. A small swab on a stick, dampened. This will help with the dryness in the meantime. I took it. Better than nothing. Once the doctor and nurse had gone, the officer shifted in his chair. Feeling up to a few questions? I told him everything. The ambush, tongue, the sharpened piece of metal used to stab me, not knowing why the man attacked me, that he had come at me unprovoked. An internal investigation was already underway. He told me when I had finished. The 2 weeks in the hospital were obviously different from prison time. Meals arrived on trays, the nurses kept a close eye on my recovery. The sounds outside the window were city sounds, ordinary and continuous. Listening to them, I thought I would have liked my old life back, the clean desk, the morning commute, coming home to Cho. Then I thought about Zhang and Zhu, even Wang. I supposed I had a life in there too. On the 8th day, a different officer came, someone senior, with a recorder and a form. He explained that the internal disciplinary proceedings required a formal recorded statement from me before any decision could be reached. It took 40 minutes to complete the record. My stay was extended by another week after the initial 2 weeks. Even though I missed Zhang a bit, I didn't mind. Healing properly was important, and a bit more outside air before going back to years of prison air was not unwelcome. I took regular walks in the hospital park and called Cho occasionally, keeping my voice easy, not once mentioning the attack. Throughout my stay, a police officer had been stationed outside my room. On the morning of my discharge, he shared an update. The disciplinary board had reached its decision. Tung had been transferred to a higher security facility in another region 2 days prior, deemed a serious and ongoing risk to the facility and its inmates, all thanks to my statement, Tung's history, the manufactured weapon, the absence of any plausible account from Tung's side. My heart soared. At the prison, Wang thumped me on the back in welcome. The rest of the group were also present. As I headed to the library, I looked down at my pale blue uniform. When had it begun to feel comfortable? I side-eyed Zhang when his shoulder brushed mine, back at my side and unnecessarily close. He'd nearly cried when I turned up at the doorway of our room. A kiss on his cheek, then his lips had calmed him down. Shu was in the common area when I came through. He came running and hugged me. I caught Zhang rolling his eyes. "You look thinner." "Hospital food," I said. He glanced at Zhang with barely concealed delight. "Zhang saved up the best snacks for you, haven't you, Zhang?" Zhang didn't bother answering Shu. He looked at me instead and said, "I was going to give them to you after dinner." Once we settled at a table in the corner, Shu leaned in and said, low enough that it was just for me, "Zhang was miserable. The whole time. So very miserable, I'm just telling you. As information." I leaned back. "Thank you for the information." Then I grinned. "So glad Tung is gone." Shu nodded. "Good riddance. Oh, and did Wang tell you? We've absorbed a few of his former group. The ones who had the sense joined us. The rest are keeping to themselves." His smile grew wider. "And guh-guh? Don't worry, it's all settled." "What is?" Once Tung was transferred, Zhang and I paid a visit to the 3 who liked to hang around him the most. The ones who thought it was funny. Wang lent us a few of his men as well. Nothing too serious, just enough to make the point. "Does Zhang know about our rebirth?" Shu shook his head. "I only told him that you disliked those 3 men and then he was jumping to help. Will you ever tell him?" I hesitated. Honestly, I wasn't sure, but I could see myself telling him one day. Maybe someday. That night, in our cell, I turned to Zhang. "Come here." He came, I put my arms around him and held on. He reciprocated. We stayed like that for a while, then I pulled back slightly and looked up at him. "Why do you like me so much?" I found it funny, the sheer, almost obsessive quality of Zhang's attachment. I had thought about it a lot and never came up with a good enough reason. Zhang didn't respond for some time. Eventually he did, ears red. "You're just my type, and you took care of me when I was sick. No one does that, besides my mother." I thought back to it, the fever that had come on suddenly one night, Zhang burning up. I had done what anyone would do for someone who was sick, fetched water, wrung out a cool cloth and pressed it to his forehead, sat with him through the worst of it, made sure he ate something when the fever broke, brought him medicine from the infirmary. It had been the most ordinary thing in the world to me. The same thing I had done for Cho 100 times without thinking twice about it. But Zhang had been falling for me. I laughed. Then I kissed him. He moved to deepen it, and I put a hand on his chest. "Let's wait for lights out." When he caught the implication, he flushed, nodding quickly. I kissed his cheek and sat on his bed. Zhang sat too. Then he cleared his throat and said, "I'll be gentle." Before I could respond, he slipped a hand under his mattress and pulled out a dozen shiny, square-shaped packets. I blinked. "How did you get them in?" "Wang gave them to me. Said I might need them someday." I looked at the ceiling. The next morning, the bell rang at 6:30 and I woke up sore. I'd let Zhang's enthusiasm get the better of me and was paying the price for it. I decided then and there such strenuous activities were to be done weekly at most, possibly fortnightly. I'd make sure Zhang would listen. Epilogue. A month after Tung's transfer, I found Shu in the corridor outside the visiting room. He had been restless ever since I'd told him about Cho's visit. I had spoken to the warden on duty 2 days before. I had made my request carefully, drawing on every pleading capacity I possessed. The man had looked at me for a long moment and then told me to keep it to myself and make sure it didn't become a habit. Now I stopped in front of Shu and couldn't stop smiling. "Come on." He didn't move. "Where?" "Visiting room." Shu's face changed. He looked at me more carefully. Then his eyes went wide. "Are you serious?" I nodded. He gave a whoop and followed. Cho was already there. He was sitting at the table nearest the window. His eyes went to me first, the automatic check, and then moved to the person beside me and stayed there. Shu had gone very still. I bet he was nervous. I kept walking and sat down across from Cho and began opening the bag he'd brought with him. Beside me, I heard Shu sit down. "This is Zhu," I said, without looking up from the bag. Cho was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm Cho. It's nice to meet you." "I know who you are," Shu said. It came out slightly rougher than he probably intended. "Shin talks about you. A lot." Finished opening the containers. "Let's feast." As we ate, Cho asked Shu questions about prison life with great curiosity. Shu answered them all with the widest smile. I said very little. When the hour ended, Cho packed the empty containers and promised to bring even better food next time. Then he looked at Shu. "I'll bring some for you too. What do you like?" Shu blinked, probably not expecting such generosity. He broke into the sappiest grin. "Beef soup noodles, if it's not too much trouble." I hugged Cho goodbye. Shu sat looking at the door through which Cho had gone. I led him, then we gathered ourselves and headed back. Zhang was waiting. He was standing precisely where the corridor opened from the visiting area into the main block with his arms crossed. Then Shu, who was still in the warm aftermath of the visit, put his arms around me, especially to move on. "Thank you, guh-guh." "Thank you." I was about to put my arms around him in return when... "What?" demanded Zhang. "Are you doing?" He reached us in seconds. Shu stepped back and put both hands up. Easy, Zhang. Shin guh-guh is like a brother to me. I'm like a brother to him. I've hugged him before. There's nothing else. Zhang's eyes moved to me. I stepped toward him, took his hand, and leaned up and said, close to his ear, "Behave, and I'll reward you well." Expectedly, Zhang's ears went red. He nodded without a word. Beside us, Shu laughed. Zhang fell into step beside me as we moved back into the corridor, shoulders brushing, of course. I was a convicted murderer, serving 7 years. I had done what I came back to do. Cho was alive. I had a sticky lover, a good brother, born out of the strangest of second chances. And honestly, the years ahead of me didn't seem all that bad. The end.